March 17, 1966. A Viet Cong sentry who survived 2 years in the jungle never heard them coming. 4 shadows materialized from the darkness. 90 seconds later, 4 sentries lay dead in absolute silence. By dawn, an entire enemy base camp had vanished into smoke. The bodies left behind were arranged in a specific pattern, a calling card. The Australian SAS had arrived in Vietnam, and the masters of jungle warfare were about to learn what true fear felt like. Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam, March 17, 1966, exactly 03:42 hours. Nguyen Van Tam had learned to survive where most men died. 2 years fighting in the jungle had honed his senses to razor sharpness. He could detect American patrols from half a kilometer away by the smell of their cigarettes and bug spray. He could identify helicopter types by sound alone in complete darkness. The jungle spoke to him in whispers that others couldn't hear. Tonight, the jungle was silent, too silent. Tam's post overlooked the main approach to the base camp, a cluster of concealed hooches sheltering 18 Viet Cong fighters, 2 carefully hidden weapons caches, and a communications relay that connected 3 provincial units. It was a valuable position, one that had survived American sweeps through careful camouflage and constant vigilance. Tam took his duty seriously. Every 2 hours he made his rounds, checking the other 3 sentries positioned around the perimeter. At 03:42, he turned to wake his comrade for the next rotation. A gloved hand covered his mouth. He felt pressure, then nothing. Nguyen Van Tam's war ended without a sound ever leaving his throat. 30 meters away, the second sentry died the same way, then the third, then the fourth. 90 seconds from first contact to complete perimeter breach. Not a single shot fired, not a single alarm raised. The 4 men who had materialized from the triple canopy jungle moved like smoke through water. They wore no reflective equipment. They carried no items that rattled or clinked. Their faces were painted in patterns that broke up human features in the darkness. They communicated through hand signals so subtle that someone watching might miss them entirely. These weren't ordinary soldiers playing at stealth. These were hunters who had perfected their craft over years of training that broke 9 out of 10 candidates who attempted it. By 04 hours, the Viet Cong base camp ceased to exist. The 18 fighters never woke up. The weapons caches erupted in carefully placed explosive charges. The communications equipment melted under thermite grenades that burned hot enough to fuse metal into slag. By 04:30, the 4-man patrol had vanished back into the jungle, leaving only corpses arranged in a deliberate pattern. A message, a signature, a calling card that would be discussed in Hanoi intelligence briefings for the next 3 years. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment had arrived in Vietnam. In the capital of North Vietnam, intelligence officers pored over reports with growing concern. These weren't the Americans. The Americans they understood. Americans arrived in helicopters that could be heard from kilometers away. Americans moved in large formations that left trails a child could follow. Americans brought overwhelming firepower, but rarely brought patience. These new operators were different. They appeared and disappeared like spirits. They killed with surgical precision. They left no survivors to tell tales, only bodies and a growing legend that would make the Viet Cong fear the jungle itself. The Americans would fight their war one way, big and loud and technological, throwing the might of the world's most powerful military against an enemy that refused to stand and fight in conventional terms. The SAS would fight their war another way entirely, silent and patient and absolutely lethal. 2 philosophies, same jungle. Only one would make the enemy abandon their own territory without a single major battle. When the first Australian and British SAS advisors arrived in Southeast Asia in the early 1960s, American commanders were skeptical at best, dismissive at worst. Major General William Westmoreland, reviewing Allied contributions in 1964, noted in a memo that would later become famous for its irony, "The British offer expertise in counterinsurgency. Whether their methods suit our operational tempo remains to be seen." The subtext was clear. The Americans had firepower, they had mobility, they had modern doctrine developed by the best military minds that West Point and the Pentagon could produce. They had M16 rifles, Huey helicopters, artillery support on demand, and B-52 bombers for anything truly serious. What could a small contingent of soldiers from a fading empire possibly teach the United States military? The British and Australian SAS had something else entirely. They had 12 years of hard-won experience defeating communist insurgents in the Malayan Emergency, a brutal jungle conflict that had taught them lessons written in blood and patience. They had perfected the art of long-range jungle patrolling, small unit operations, and hearts and minds counterinsurgency that actually worked. They had learned that patience wasn't just a tactical advantage. It was the difference between coming home and dying in an ambush you never saw coming. Major Peter Walsh, a British SAS advisor who served in Vietnam from 1963 to 1964, would later explain the fundamental philosophical divide. The Americans wanted to find the enemy and destroy him with maximum force, he recalled. We wanted to understand him first, then remove him surgically. Different philosophies entirely. They were fighting a war of attrition. We were fighting a war of intelligence and precision. Early joint operations revealed stark contrasts that sometimes bordered on the absurd. An Australian SAS squadron could patrol for 2 weeks on what an American infantry platoon consumed in 3 days. The Australians moved through jungle without breaking branches, leaving trails so faint that even experienced trackers struggled to follow them hours later. They set ambushes that waited for days if necessary, teams lying in the same position for 16 hours without moving, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They communicated with hand signals that eliminated radio chatter, operating in silence so complete it seemed unnatural. American advisors watching Australian SAS training exercises were impressed by the discipline and skill on display, but they remained unconvinced these tactics would scale to the kind of war they were planning to fight. The Pentagon's thinking was rooted in overwhelming force and attrition warfare. Search and destroy operations would find large enemy formations and obliterate them with superior firepower. Body counts would measure progress. Technology would overcome terrain disadvantages. It was a doctrine built on American industrial might and conventional military superiority. The SAS approach seemed almost quaint by comparison. 4 to 6 man teams operating independently for weeks, minimal contact with the enemy, maximum intelligence gathering, precise targeting of high-value individuals and logistics networks. It was counterinsurgency as scalpel versus hammer. To American commanders planning division-level operations, it looked like a return to colonial-era tactics that had no place in modern warfare. Vietnamese communist commanders initially dismissed reports of these new operators as exaggerations or propaganda. They had fought the French for 8 years and survived. They had endured American bombing campaigns that dropped more tonnage than all of World War II. They controlled vast swaths of jungle through intimate knowledge of terrain and support from local populations. A few dozen foreign soldiers in the bush seemed irrelevant compared to entire divisions of American troops backed by aircraft carriers and B-52s. That perception would change violently. The Australian SAS regiment arrived in Puoc Tuy province in 1966 as part of the Australian Task Force commitment to Vietnam. Unlike their American counterparts, organized into large infantry battalions with hundreds of men, the Australians deployed in squadron strength, roughly 110 to 120 men, who would operate primarily in small patrol units. These weren't regular soldiers given a few weeks of special training and turned loose. The SAS regiment drew from Australia's finest soldiers who had survived selection courses with 90% failure rates. Men who had trained in the same traditions as Britain's legendary 22 SAS regiment. Many had studied under Malayan emergency veterans, learning lessons that couldn't be found in any manual or taught in any conventional school. Their training emphasized skills that American doctrine largely ignored. Silent movement through triple canopy jungle where a snapped branch could mean death. Tracking humans and animals by signs so subtle most people would never notice them. Observation skills that could catalog enemy positions from kilometers away, with nothing but patience and binoculars. And above all, patience itself, the willingness to wait hours or days for the perfect moment, rather than forcing action prematurely. An SAS patrol could lie motionless for 16 hours, watching an enemy trail, cataloging every person who passed, noting weapons and equipment and direction of travel. Then they would execute a perfect ambush in 30 seconds, killing or capturing their targets with surgical precision, and then they would vanish before reinforcements arrived, melting back into the jungle like ghosts. This wasn't bravado or theatrics. It was the result of training so intense and selection so brutal that only the very best survived to wear the sand-colored beret. British SAS advisors, though fewer in number, brought even deeper expertise. They had trained with Gurkhas in Malaya. They had fought in Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation. They had developed tactics for jungle warfare that contradicted conventional military wisdom at every turn. Sergeant John Lofty Large, a British SAS advisor in 1965, explained it simply. We learned to think like hunters, not soldiers. Patience wasn't just a virtue, it was survival. The jungle rewards the patient and kills the hasty. That lesson cost us men to learn, but once learned, it became doctrine. The Americans used helicopters as taxis, flying into landing zones with maximum noise and minimum concern for alerting the enemy. The philosophy was simple. Get troops on the ground fast. Establish fire superiority, call in air support if needed. Speed and firepower would overcome any tactical disadvantage from a noisy insertion. The SAS used helicopters sparingly, often walking dozens of kilometers to insertion points to avoid alerting the enemy to their presence. They understood that in jungle warfare, surprise was worth more than speed. American patrols might number 30 to 40 men, enough firepower to handle most contact situations through sheer volume of fire. SAS patrols typically ran 4 to 6 men, small enough to hide in terrain where 30 men would be spotted immediately, large enough to fight briefly if discovered, and trained to break contact rather than stand and fight. The philosophy was fundamentally different. Americans wanted to find the enemy and destroy him. SAS wanted to avoid contact unless they held every advantage. Even their weapon preferences revealed philosophical differences. Americans carried M16 rifles with full automatic capability, designed for suppressive fire, and overwhelming an enemy position with sheer volume. SAS preferred L1A1 self-loading rifles and suppressed Sterling submachine guns, semi-automatic weapons that emphasized precision over spray and pray tactics. Every round counted when resupply required days of walking through hostile territory. Ammunition discipline wasn't just good practice, it was survival necessity. The intelligence-gathering focus separated them even further. While American units measured success in enemy killed in action, carefully counted and reported up the chain of command for body count statistics, SAS patrols prioritized intelligence. They photographed documents found in enemy camps. They tracked movement patterns for weeks to establish routine and vulnerability. They identified supply routes that could be targeted to strangle enemy logistics. They captured weapons for technical analysis to understand enemy capabilities. They would shadow enemy units for days, never engaging, just collecting information that would be far more valuable than any immediate firefight. By late 1966, this approach started producing results that American intelligence officers couldn't ignore. SAS patrols were locating enemy base camps, supply caches, and movement patterns with uncanny accuracy. Their stay-behind operations, remaining in areas after major American operations moved through, revealed an uncomfortable truth. The Viet Cong simply waited out the Americans in hidden tunnels and bunkers, then returned to their positions once the sweep passed. The Americans were fighting a war of presence. The VC were fighting a war of patience. One operation in November 1966 exemplified the difference perfectly. A large American search and destroy sweep through suspected VC territory found nothing. Helicopters landed hundreds of troops. Artillery pounded suspected positions for hours. Infantry swept through in line formations. After 3 days, they reported no significant contact and withdrew. The intelligence assessment concluded the area was clear of enemy forces. 1 week later, an Australian SAS 4-man patrol inserted into the exact same area. They would remain for 12 days, moving less than 8 kilometers total. They photographed 3 VC camps. They documented supply routes used for moving weapons and rice. They identified a battalion headquarters concealed so well that American patrols had walked past it twice. They called in precision strikes that destroyed months of accumulated VC logistics, all without firing a shot until their extraction. Operation Crimp in February 1966 became the moment when everything changed. When American commanders began to understand that their opponents weren't just hiding in the jungle, they were hiding under it. American and Australian forces launched a major operation into the Hobo Woods northwest of Saigon, a known Viet Cong stronghold that had frustrated previous attempts to pacify it. The Americans went in loud, as always. Helicopters announced their arrival from kilometers away. Artillery preparation pounded suspected positions. Infantry swept forward in company strength. The Australians went in quiet, small patrols, careful movement, eyes open for details that others missed. Corporal Bob Bowtell of the 1st Special Air Service Squadron was leading a patrol when his point man, Trooper Danny Smith, stopped suddenly. No verbal warning, just a raised fist in the signal for freeze. The entire patrol stopped instantly, trusting Smith's instincts without question. Smith had spotted freshly turned earth that didn't match the surroundings. In the jungle, everything has a pattern. Break that pattern and someone trained to look will notice. Smith noticed. What they discovered would change American understanding of the war they were fighting. The Ku Chai tunnels. Not just foxholes or fighting positions, but an entire underground city. 200 kilometers of tunnels complete with hospitals, weapons factories, sleeping quarters, command centers, and supply depots. The Americans had been walking over the enemy for months, searching for base camps above ground while entire battalions lived and operated beneath their feet. But discovering tunnels and clearing them required very different skills. American tunnel rats, volunteers for the nightmare duty of crawling into black holes with nothing but a pistol and flashlight, faced impossible odds. The Viet Cong had every advantage underground. They knew every turn and junction. They had booby traps at critical points. They had punji stakes positioned at blind corners. They could hear Americans coming and prepare ambushes in absolute darkness. The tunnel rats were incredibly brave men doing impossible work, and their casualty rates reflected it. The SAS approached tunnels differently. Sergeant Jim Weir of 3 Squadron SAS explained the philosophy. We didn't send men into tunnels unless absolutely necessary. We'd map entrance points, identify ventilation shafts, then pump in CS gas and collapse strategic sections. If intelligence value was high enough, we'd send someone down, but never alone. Always with backup position to extract him fast if things went wrong. The difference was philosophical. Americans cleared tunnels to deny the enemy their use. SAS destroyed tunnels to render them permanently unusable, or exploited them for intelligence and then destroyed them. Same objective, different methods reflecting different understandings of what they were trying to accomplish. In March 1966, an SAS patrol in Phuoc Tuy province made contact that would become legendary among Viet Cong units that survived to tell about it. The 4-man patrol, callsign Charlie 1, was conducting a routine observation mission along a known enemy infiltration route. They had been in position for 6 hours, watching a trail junction from concealed positions 30 meters back in the thick jungle. Standard procedure: watch, record, report. Avoid contact unless absolutely necessary or tactically advantageous. At 14:23 hours, a 20-man VC unit appeared on the trail, moving with the confidence of men in their own territory. The patrol commander, Sergeant Jim Campbell, made a split-second assessment. Standard protocol dictated break contact and evade, radio in the sighting and let artillery or air support handle it. But Campbell saw something that changed his calculation. The VC were moving without the usual caution of men expecting trouble. They were relaxed, talking among themselves, weapons slung casually. They thought they were safe. Campbell made a different call. His patrol would wait and watch. 20 meters from their concealed position, the VC unit stopped. They stacked weapons against trees. They removed packs. They were taking a rest break right in front of 4 SAS soldiers who could have killed half of them in the first burst of fire. The temptation to initiate contact must have been enormous, but Campbell held his team. Patience. Wait. Observe. For 43 minutes, Campbell's patrol remained absolutely frozen while the VC smoked cigarettes, talked, shared food, and rested in the shade. 43 minutes of controlled breathing, of mosquitoes biting and not being able to swat them, of muscles screaming from holding the same position, of watching enemy soldiers sit close enough to touch. The discipline required is almost impossible to comprehend. One cough, one involuntary movement, one piece of equipment that made a sound. Any of those would have triggered a firefight that might have killed the patrol. The VC finally moved out, shouldering packs and picking up weapons with the casual efficiency of men who had done it 1,000 times. They headed west along the trail, disappearing into the jungle. Campbell waited another 10 minutes to ensure they weren't doubling back, then made his decision. His patrol would follow them. For 2 kilometers, 4 SAS soldiers shadowed 20 Viet Cong fighters through their own territory, maintaining distance and concealment that kept them invisible. The VC never knew they were being followed. The trail led to a company-sized base camp, concealed in heavy jungle with overhead cover to defeat aerial reconnaissance. Weapons caches were visible under camouflage nets. Supply stores were stacked in waterproof bunkers. This wasn't a temporary position. This was an established base that had been there for months. Campbell's patrol observed for another 4 hours, cataloging positions, counting personnel, noting defensive arrangements. Then they withdrew silently and radioed in the intelligence. The next morning at 06:15 hours, Australian artillery and American airstrikes obliterated the position. 67 confirmed enemy killed, massive weapons losses, supply stockpiles destroyed. The company-sized VC unit effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. And the survivors, the few who had been away from the camp or somehow survived the bombardment, never knew how they had been found. Their security had been good. Their camouflage had been excellent. They had operated from that base for 4 months without detection. One afternoon, they took a rest break on a trail. The next morning, everyone was dead. But Sergeant Jim Campbell added one more element that elevated the operation from tactical success to psychological warfare. Before his patrol withdrew, they left notes at the ambush site, written in Vietnamese by an interpreter. Simple message, 5 words: "We have been watching you." The survivors who found those notes understood the implication. The ghosts weren't just stumbling onto VC positions. They were tracking them, studying them, knowing their movements before they made them. The operation that truly broke Viet Cong confidence occurred in June 1966. Lieutenant John White led an SAS patrol that would track a VC unit for 5 days through Phuoc Tuy province, not following trails, not relying on intelligence reports or aerial reconnaissance, actually tracking human beings through jungle like animals, reading signs that most trained soldiers would never notice. White's patrol picked up the trail at a known river crossing point, where VC units moved between operational areas. The signs were faint, almost invisible. Bent grass that hadn't fully recovered, disturbed leaves that were slightly discolored where they had been stepped on, a partial boot print in soft soil that had been partially obscured by brushing. To most soldiers, these would be invisible or meaningless. To White's patrol, they were a roadmap. For 5 days, the patrol followed that trail through some of the most difficult terrain in Vietnam. They moved slowly, sometimes covering less than 2 kilometers in a day. They observed without interfering. They documented everything: movement patterns, rest stops, security procedures, communication methods. They identified the unit as a reinforced platoon with 2 senior commanders traveling with them, unusual enough to indicate something important was happening. They cataloged base locations and cache sites that the unit visited. They never got close enough to be detected, but they were never so far that they lost the trail. The intelligence White's patrol brought back enabled a coordinated ambush that killed the entire enemy leadership element. 17 men, including 2 senior commanders who were traveling to a provincial meeting. The ambush was perfectly positioned based on White's documentation of their movement patterns and route preferences. The VC walked into it with no warning, no chance to return effective fire, no opportunity to escape. In 45 seconds, a unit that had taken 5 days to track ceased to exist. But Lieutenant White added his own psychological warfare element. His patrol left notes at the ambush site written in Vietnamese, left where survivors would find them. "We've been watching you." Simple words, devastating implications. The VC were no longer hunting their enemies through the jungle. They were being hunted. The psychological impact of that reversal cannot be overstated. By August 1966, Viet Cong intelligence reports were documenting a disturbing pattern that their commanders struggled to explain. Small enemy units were operating deep in VC-controlled territory. They appeared and disappeared with no apparent pattern. They seemed to know VC movements before the VC made them. They killed silently and efficiently, often arranging bodies in specific patterns that served as signatures. and nobody could figure out who they were or how to stop them. A captured document from September 1966, recovered from a VC base camp, revealed the impact in stark terms. The document was a security directive from Provincial Command. Unknown enemy forces, possibly elite American or foreign troops, have established presence in our base areas. They employ unusual tactics and demonstrate capabilities beyond typical American units. Avoid engagement if possible. Report all unusual jungle signs immediately. Do not use regular trails. Increase security measures at all permanent positions. The Viet Cong, masters of jungle warfare who had fought and defeated the French, who had survived years of American bombing, were now afraid of their own jungle. The VC response to SAS tactics revealed how deeply the threat had penetrated their operational confidence. By late 1966, VC units operating in areas with known SAS presence implemented security protocols that units in purely American-dominated areas didn't bother with. They stopped using regular trails entirely, cutting new paths daily and abandoning them after single use. They doubled sentry rotations, putting half their force on guard duty at night, instead of the usual quarter. They began random camp relocations every 3 days instead of weekly moves. They instituted buddy systems where no one moved alone, even for latrine calls 30 meters from the camp perimeter. These measures significantly degraded their operational efficiency, which was exactly what the SAS intended. Captain Ron Large of the Australian SAS explained the strategy. "We weren't trying to kill every VC in Vietnam. That was impossible and unnecessary. We were trying to make them ineffective. A VC unit spending half its energy on security measures can't spend it planning operations. They're burning calories moving camp every 3 days. They're exhausted from doubled guard rotations. They're paranoid about every sound in the jungle. We were winning by making them paranoid and exhausted." The SAS evolved their methods based on VC reactions. They developed step-up tactics where a successful ambush would be immediately followed by positioning another ambush on the logical retreat route. VC fleeing the first contact would run straight into the second. Survivors of the second ambush, now completely panicked, would flee to what they thought was a rally point only to find a third team waiting. It was psychological destruction more than physical. Sergeant Dave Curtin of 2 Squadron SAS described the impact. After 3 consecutive ambushes on what should have been their safe withdrawal routes, enemy units started surrendering rather than running. They couldn't trust their own operational planning anymore. When you can't trust your own escape routes, you can't function as a military unit. The British SAS advisory role expanded significantly in 1967, bringing refinements from their Borneo operations during the Indonesian confrontation. They introduced claret operations to Vietnam, unauthorized cross-border raids that officially never happened. Small SAS teams would cross into Cambodia, under cover of darkness, target VC sanctuary areas that were supposedly off-limits, then fade back into Vietnam before anyone could mount an effective response. These operations remained classified for decades, but they were whispered about in VC base camps along the border. The ghosts could cross any border. Nowhere was truly safe. American units began requesting SAS training as word of their effectiveness spread. The U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, established specialized courses where Australian SAS instructors taught American long-range reconnaissance patrol units. The lessons were simple in concept but difficult in execution. Move slower, observe more, shoot less. Think like prey pretending to be predator. Wait for certainty instead of acting on possibility. Intelligence matters more than body counts. Some American units adapted brilliantly. MACV-SOG, the covert special operations group running classified missions across Southeast Asia, adopted SAS techniques wholesale. Their cross-border operations into Laos and Cambodia mirrored SAS methodology. Small teams, surgical strikes, maximum intelligence value, minimum footprint. They became extremely effective, developing reputations that rivaled the SAS among enemy forces who survived encounters with them. But cultural differences persisted throughout the war. American military culture rewarded aggression and contact. Officers got promoted based on successful engagements. Body counts mattered in after-action reports and efficiency ratings. Making contact with the enemy was considered success. SAS culture rewarded intelligence and restraint. Patrols that never fired a shot but brought back actionable intelligence that led to successful operations were celebrated. Avoiding contact unless you held every advantage was considered professional excellence. As one American long-range reconnaissance patrol veteran noted years later, "We wanted to kill the enemy. They wanted to understand him first, then kill him efficiently." It sounds like a subtle difference, but it's a totally different mindset. We measured success by contact. They measured success by outcome. Sometimes the best way to kill the enemy is to watch him for a week first. The Viet Cong tried to adapt their counter-tactics specifically for SAS operations. They began using decoy camps with deliberately obvious security flaws designed to draw in patrols. They positioned quick reaction forces in concealment around suspected observation posts, ready to surround and eliminate anyone watching. They even deployed their own small hunter-killer teams to track the trackers, using the jungle skills they had honed over years to hunt these ghosts. It rarely worked. The SAS were simply better at a game the VC thought they had mastered. Former VC commander Nguyen Mon Ten, interviewed in 1995 after normalization of relations between Vietnam and Australia, provided rare insight into how the enemy viewed these operators. The VC were good. We knew the jungle. We knew how to move, how to hide, how to fight. But the SAS were different. They thought like us, moved like us, but had training and discipline we couldn't match. Fighting Americans was fighting an army with all their advantages and disadvantages. Fighting SAS was fighting shadows that killed. You never knew where they were. You never knew when they would strike. And when they did strike, it was always perfect. No mistakes. No mercy, no survivors to learn from their methods. By 1968, SAS operations in Vietnam had achieved what conventional forces couldn't: dominance in enemy-controlled territory. The Tet Offensive, which surprised American forces across South Vietnam in January and February 1968, found Australian SAS squadrons ready and waiting. They had been reporting the build-up for weeks through their continuous patrol operations. While American intelligence was caught off guard by the scale and coordination of the attacks, Australian intelligence officers had detailed reports of troop movements, supply accumulations, and preparation activities. In Phuoc Tuy Province, SAS patrols provided early warning that allowed the Australian task force to prepare defensive positions and position quick reaction forces. While American bases were overrun elsewhere, with desperate fighting and heavy casualties, the Australians repelled attacks with minimal losses. The difference wasn't courage or firepower. Both sides had plenty of both. The difference was intelligence. SAS teams had been watching the attack preparations develop in real time, reporting every detail, building a picture that let commanders prepare for what was coming. The statistics tell part of the story, though statistics can never capture the full reality of war. From 1966 to 1971, Australian SAS squadrons rotated through Vietnam, with approximately 600 total personnel. They inflicted over 500 confirmed enemy killed in action. The intelligence they collected led to operations that produced thousands more casualties. They suffered just 3 killed in action during 5 years of continuous operations in enemy territory. That's a kill ratio of roughly 167 to 1. Numbers that defy conventional warfare mathematics and seem almost fictional. But the numbers miss the psychological impact, which was far more significant than the body count. A captured North Vietnamese Army officer, interrogated in 1969, described his unit's standing orders regarding SAS patrols. "If you see them, don't engage. Report position and withdraw immediately. They always have support nearby and they never lose. Engaging them is suicide." That last part wasn't strictly true. SAS patrols could be overwhelmed by superior numbers if caught in the open. They weren't superhuman. They could be killed like anyone else. But the perception was what mattered in the jungle. The perception controlled behavior. Vietnamese communist units genuinely believed that engaging an SAS patrol was suicide. They believed the Australians never lost because the few survivors of SAS ambushes never stayed around long enough to see the patrol withdraw. They experienced perfect ambushes, devastating fire, and then nothing as the enemy vanished. From their perspective, the SAS were ghosts who struck with perfect precision and disappeared without trace. The reality was more nuanced, but reality wasn't what controlled decision-making when you heard a twig snap in the darkness. Perhaps the ultimate measure of SAS effectiveness came not from friendly action, but from enemy inaction. By 1969, certain areas of Phuoc Tuy province were effectively Viet Cong free, not because of major combat operations or sustained artillery bombardment, but because the VC simply abandoned them. The cost of operating in SAS-dominated territory exceeded any strategic benefit those areas provided. They couldn't move safely. They couldn't rest securely. They couldn't plan effectively. Every operation required doubled security that exhausted the troops. Every camp relocation consumed resources. Every night brought the possibility that shadows were watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The SAS had won without fighting, which according to Sun Tzu is the highest form of warfare. The ancient Chinese military philosopher wrote that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. The Viet Cong understood Sun Tzu intimately. They had studied his teachings. They had applied his principles throughout the war against the French, and now against the Americans. Being beaten at their own philosophy by foreign soldiers who had perfected those principles through training and discipline was a bitter pill that some units never recovered from. The Australian SAS withdrew from Vietnam in 1971, their mission complete as far as Australian government commitments were concerned. They had proven that small unit excellence, properly applied with the right tactics and training, could achieve strategic effects that massive conventional operations couldn't. They had demonstrated that quality mattered more than quantity in unconventional warfare. They had shown that patience and intelligence could defeat aggression and firepower. The Americans would continue their war for another 4 years, escalating and then withdrawing in defeat. But the lessons the SAS taught had been learned, if not always applied. Major General John Essex Clark, who commanded Australian SAS squadrons during their Vietnam deployment, reflected on the experience years later. "We didn't win the Vietnam War. That was never our mission, and frankly, it probably couldn't be won the way it was being fought. But we showed there was a better way to fight it. We proved that counterinsurgency done right, with patience and intelligence and respect for the enemy's capabilities, could achieve results." Whether anyone was listening is another question. The modern Special Operations Forces worldwide study SAS operations in Vietnam as masterclass examples of counterinsurgency done right. The patience to watch for days before striking, the intelligence focus that valued information over body counts, the restraint to avoid contact unless every advantage was on your side. These principles became doctrinal foundations for special operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and conflicts that continue today. The ghost soldiers of Vietnam wrote the textbook that modern operators still study. The Viet Cong learned their own lessons, though theirs came at a higher price. Truong Nhu Tung, a former Viet Cong fighter who later wrote his memoir after the war, provided perhaps the most honest assessment from the enemy perspective. The American military was powerful but predictable. They moved in patterns. They used their technology as a crutch. They relied on firepower to solve problems that required intelligence. The SAS was different. They were patient, precise, and terrifying in their efficiency. We feared them because they fought like we did, only better. They had our jungle skills but refined through professional training. They had our patience but backed by superior discipline. They had our willingness to endure hardship, but with better equipment and support. That fear was the SAS's greatest weapon. Not the L1A1 rifles that could drop a man at 600 meters. Not the training that could produce soldiers capable of remaining motionless for 16 hours. Not even the kill ratios that read like something from ancient Sparta. The greatest weapon was fear. Fear that the jungle itself had turned against the Viet Cong. Fear that nowhere was safe anymore. Fear that the hunters had become the hunted. Fear that the enemy knew your movements before you made them. Fear that 4 men in the darkness could end your entire unit before you fired a shot in return. These words cannot fully capture what those 4-man patrols accomplished in the Vietnamese highlands and jungles. Statistics and after-action reports and historical analysis all fall short of the reality. But those patrols proved a timeless truth, that warfare keeps teaching, and nations keep forgetting. In unconventional warfare, the quality of soldiers matters infinitely more than quantity. Precision beats firepower every single time. Patience conquers aggression. Understanding defeats force. The Americans brought an army to Vietnam, They brought helicopters and artillery and B-52s and more firepower than any military in human history. They brought courage and dedication and young men willing to die for their country. But they brought a conventional military mindset to an unconventional war. The SAS brought something more dangerous than firepower. They brought understanding. Understanding that winning hearts and minds required protecting villages, not destroying them to save them. Understanding that intelligence mattered more than body counts, that knowing where the enemy would be tomorrow was worth more than killing him today. Understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing a soldier can do is watch and wait and strike only when victory is absolutely assured. Understanding that making the enemy afraid to operate in his own territory was worth more than any tactical victory. The Viet Cong feared the Australian SAS because the SAS were everything the VC thought they themselves were, but refined through professional military training, superior discipline, and a special operations tradition stretching back to the Second World War. The VC were masters of jungle warfare, feared by conventional forces throughout the conflict. But when those masters of guerrilla warfare met soldiers who had studied their methods and perfected them into an art form backed by selection that only accepted the very best, fear was the only rational response. 4 men moving through the jungle in silence, watching, waiting, understanding their enemy better than the enemy understood himself, striking with surgical precision when the moment was perfect, vanishing before reinforcements arrived, leaving only bodies and fear, and a reputation that made the enemy abandon territory without a fight. That was the Australian SAS in Vietnam. That was why the Viet Cong feared them more than divisions of American troops. That was the weapon that won battles without fighting them. Understanding, patience, precision, and fear. If you found this story fascinating, hit that subscribe button to join our community. Drop a like if you learned something new today, and leave a comment telling us which SAS operation impressed you most. Your support helps us bring more untold military history to light. Thanks for watching.